I read A Breathless Sky by Veronica G Henry. This is the first time that I've read this book, and it's follow-up to The Canopy Keepers, and it makes up a duology between the two books. There's no other books in the series, I believe. It's called the Scorched Earth series. I talked about the first book, I think it's the first episode of this podcast, actually, because it just happened to fall where I was reading it at the end of last year. So this book picks up where the other one left off. Syra, I'm not sure how to say the main character's name. I call her Sarah. She is in the kind of fantasy world where it's called the Ryza, and it's the way that all the fantasy forest creatures are like connected to each other through a mycelial network of fungus. And the fungus is also in her body, which has given her kind of like magical superhuman capabilities. But she continues to have a mundane existence as well. So she has kind of one foot in the fantastical world of the Riza and then another foot in the Sequoia National Forest kind of governmental infrastructure. She's a guide now instead of a firefighter. Her uncle who works there has given her a job guiding people through the forest. There's kind of three sets of conflicts, I guess, throughout the story this time. On the one hand, Sarah is working to become the keeper of the forest. So she needs to pass whatever test or requirements, which are mysterious and not totally revealed to her. So she has to figure out how to do that and also have the fortitude and wherewithal to achieve it. So that's one conflict. Another conflict is introduced by a scientist who comes to the forest because in the previous book, the animals all started to attack the humans, and he wants to figure out like why did that happen, and he has theories around what it could be, and those theories would probably reveal the existence of the magical creatures. And Sarah doesn't want that to happen because she's afraid that it would lead to either exploitation or like the extermination of the magical world. Like the human military would come in and like destroy everything, basically. So she's trying to keep the mystery of that from being revealed by the scientist. And then the third conflict is with her brother who survived the events of the previous book. His name's Romello, and he was like kind of raised by all these magical creatures and has the radical position that he wants to exterminate humanity in order to save the trees, and especially save one particular tree that is very important to him. And so I think after having read the two stories and seeing where the whole thing kind of goes, it feels to me like the entire story is kind of about trauma. And I think this is one of the real strengths that fantasy affords a writer, and such a dark, interesting choice that Veronica Henry makes in building her world. You can, in fantasy, the thing that you can do that you can't really do so much in other writing as easily is take the interior emotional experience of a character and externalize it into an entire world and have them inhabit that emotional space as a world in itself. And I think that Sarah's story takes place in a world of trauma. And so if you think about the conflict that's happening here, like this is climate fiction and fantasy fiction at the same time. And it's kind of has an urban fantasy tone, especially because we're like protecting the secret magical world from exposure and knowledge to the mundane world. But the abuse that the forest has been experiencing is mundane abuse. in the same way that what's like happening in the real world, right? This is about climate change. It's about the forest fires that keep happening on the west coast of America, the kind of relentless pollution and acidification of the ocean and how that is changing the climate globally and heating everything up. That is a kind of trauma to these ancient trees that live for thousands of years. And what if these trees were self-conscious in the same way that we human beings are, is kind of the magical question that's being posed by the book. And so they've suffered a couple centuries of serious abuse, not only in the form of like being cut down and being filled with the pollution of modern society, but also these relentless fires that keep happening year after year. And so it's like really reaching a crisis point for the forest. But the setting itself, I guess, is what I'm saying is like a place of trauma, and the magical world has been traumatized. And that is what Sarah is stepping into. And she's a character who I find her psychological portrayal to be extremely realistic. She has a very hard time behaving in healthy ways, making wise decisions. She's constantly getting into like emotional freakouts. She throws tantrums. She has a lot of self-pity. She sabotages her own emotional growth. And all of those things are common to people who have PTSD, who have gone through extremely traumatic experiences, the way that she did when she lost her parents as a small child. And I think it's worth talking about on a clinical level what trauma means. So for trauma to exist, the most important aspect of the experience is that the person experiencing the trauma has no choice or no control over the experience. And so, for example, like getting into a car accident, right? Like if you're a passenger in a car or in a bus or something like that, or in an airplane, and then there's an accident involved with that vehicle, that is far more traumatic than if you were the driver of the vehicle. But even if you are the driver and you get into a serious accident, you're kind of locked into the vehicle and you're not able to like run away from the danger, or you could see the danger coming, but there's really nothing that you could do about it. And that's what causes the trauma, is the inability to act. And so when Sarah was a young child, she was not able to do anything about her family dying, including her brother. And so that's the root of her trauma, if you will. And in the same way, the forest has been suffering through the trauma of pollution and climate change and the forest fires, the mismanagement of the forest, the mismanagement of the environment by human culture. And partially because of the way that the kind of government of Riza is arranged, the forest can't really fight back despite having self-consciousness. It doesn't have agency in that way because it operates as a kind of caretaker to humanity and doesn't have a policy of kind of fighting back. That's just not the way that it's designed. There's a symbiotic relationship between humanity and all of the other animals and the giant sequoias and the forest at large. And it's not within the abilities of the forest to change that symbiotic relationship. And that's why the brother is necessary. It's the injection of Romello's hatred and his plan to kill humans that subverts the way that Riza's always been before. And so there's a kind of fighting back that can happen. And that is a taking of agency that can work as a corrective to the trauma. And that's one of the ways that PTSD can be unwound, is to kind of reenact, if you will, the trauma in some way, but to inject some kind of agency into the entire experience for the traumatized person. And then that releases the tension, that the psychic tension that was pent up because of the traumatic experience. And so I know that like a lot of this would seem like it has nothing to do with the plot, I guess, but to me, it really felt like all of the energy in Sarah's story was wrapped up in the tension, the psychic tension of her traumatized state, and that the ending had a lot to do with unwinding that entire circumstance for her, and especially by giving her agency over her circumstance and kind of reenacting the loss of her family in various ways. But in this circumstance, there's a lot of choosing, or she even, like, when she ultimately fights her brother because the two of them can't be reconciled, she does actually choose to kill him instead of failing to save him the way that she did when she was a child. And so that's like a very dark way to invert that whole thing, but it is a form of agency that I think releases the PTSD trauma that she's carrying. It's a really fascinating way to construct the whole thing, I think. And it also speaks, I think, to the kind of trauma that all of us experience as being a part of modern culture and having an awareness of climate change and the way that we are affecting the world, but not having a lot of agency in changing it. Like, you can do things yourself, of course, to try and mitigate your impact on the environment. But living in a modern capitalist society, especially in American society, it's extremely difficult to make a significant difference, as compared to major corporations that exist or huge metropolitan centers. Like, whatever you yourself could do, like personally, recycling or using vehicles that don't use gasoline, or, mitigating your carbon footprint, and on and on and on. It's a drop in the bucket compared to the kind of pollution that lots of other things are creating that are out of your control. Not to say that it doesn't matter, but like, I'm not trying to be hopeless about the whole thing, I guess, but I am saying that our agency is limited, and that is a traumatic psychic experience that we share as a culture, I think, that a lot of people share. And I think it's part of the reason that we turn to climate fiction like this, because we're looking for some kind of catharsis or a kind of integration, the way that this book offers, as like, yeah, here's a world that has that awareness built into it from the ground up. And that can be a kind of relief to read that and be like, oh, finally, like, this book gets it in a way that our society is not getting it, I guess. So I think the book delivers on that front in terms of a genre promise or a kind of catharsis that really only this type of genre can produce. I think one of the psychic consequences of PTSD in this way that Syra has is a kind of self-hatred or a fear of allowing herself to heal and become healthy, because then she is in a circumstance where she can start to lose things again, right? Like, she talks about how she's had various romantic relationships, but she's never allowed them to go very far. She's never allowed herself to fall completely in love because she doesn't know why. She's just like, it just never worked out, I guess. And so she's not aware of the way that she won't put herself in a circumstance where she could lose people again. She avoids talking to her parents all the time because, she lost these are her adopted parents, sorry. She lost her biological parents in the fire. And so by not acknowledging her parents, by not calling them, it seems like she is being cruel to them, but she's actually like protecting herself from the chance of ruining the relationship or having anything like they're always out there, as long as she doesn't call them and know what's going on with them, if that makes sense. By keeping them at arm's length, it protects her from the chance of losing them, in other words. And there's also a kind of backhanded taking of agency there too, where she had no choice of losing her parents, but she does have a choice in how her relationship with her adopted parents progresses. And so there's a kind of psychic relief to not talking to them or not calling them for her it's not healthy. It's not a great way to cope, but it is something that makes sense psychologically, I think, because it's an acting out of how to control the loss of her parents and get back some of the agency that she lost as a small child. When she's in the Riza, she's talking to one of the characters at one point named Daniel, and he went to a kind of like a jail, or he was punished basically and allowed back into their society. And the way that their punishment system works is just basically like you do your time and everyone just forgives and forgets. And she has a really hard time accepting this or trusting Daniel, because of all of these PTSD issues and her attachment issues and whatnot. But he says this really interesting thing to her that hit me as, I think, a core idea in the book. He says, "It's my belief, as it was the keepers, that topsiders are in such pain because they rarely, if ever, truly forgive others, while at the same time yearning to be forgiven for their mistakes." And I think that right there kind of sums up something that's at the core of Sarah. She even says, like, to herself inside of her own narration that she refused to reply because he had a point. She won't forgive other people, and she really does want to be released from the guilt that she carries over the loss of her family. And this relationship with guilt and forgiveness arcs over the book to the point where at the end of the book, Sarah has earned the right to be a keeper, but she hands the role over to Daniel, who she fully trusts and forgives for all of the, past problems that, like he did the time, she forgives them. Like she buys into the culture of forgiveness, in other words. And she has been trusted and forgiven by other people as well. And so she is fully like integrated into her fire crew, who take her back at the end of the book, even though she was a poor leader for them in the previous book. And then she abandoned them because she couldn't face the consequences of her choices. They forgive her for that, and they take her back in with no questions, no problems. She kind of reconciles with her mother as well, who she has a problematic relationship with. But she reaches out to her mom for advice and just talks to her and doesn't talk to the father. And that's like an unusual circumstance. And so there's just like kind of reconciliation with lots of different people. She gets into a romantic relationship where she allows herself to fall in love. And so she has a lot of growth throughout the story. But at the same time, like I talked about in the previous book, there's a kind of requirement within the story that she let go of her mundane biological family and embrace duty over the bonds that she has to other people. That's a really big part of this book and a huge difference between Sarah and Romello. Romello is concerned with saving his particular tree. He has his people who he's loyal to. He has his vision that he's protecting and not obeying the mother is what they call the kind of heart of the forest, or the heart of the Riza, the most mystical creature, the most mysterious thing that is what can appoint the new keeper of the forest. And it's not totally clear to me like what she is. I like how mysterious she is, but he doesn't have clear connection to her, and he's very invested in his own plots and his own relationships with, like I said, his particular tree and stuff. And so when it comes down to it and the forest fire is happening at the end of the story, he's trying to protect his particular tree and not the forest at large. He's trying to achieve his particular goals and not doing the will of the mother. And this is he's a failure as compared to Sarah. And she chooses to kill her brother and stop him, despite that she still loves him and still wants him to have a relationship with him and, to heal that rift between them. But she gives that up to do her duty, in the same way that in the previous book, they were requiring her to you have to leave your parents, you have to leave your uncle. So there has to be a kind of, it's a big sacrifice. She forsakes her family in order to join with this mystical forest. But she manages to achieve that in the book. And so I think, like I said, in agreeing to kill her brother or needing to kill her brother to protect the forest and fulfill her role, that is a kind of unwinding of her particular trauma around her losing her family. And it happens in a forest fire again, just like when she was a little girl. And so it's a recreation of the traumatizing event, but she has so much more agency in that event because she literally goes and fights the fire. She helps, hold the hose with the other firefighters. She fights against Romello and defeats him. She has her mystical firefighters who are out there and they're fighting the fire, and she loses some of them, but it all happens while she's side by side doing what she can to fight the fire, instead of the way that it was when she was a child and she could do nothing. And so at the end of it, while she is sad and she has lost a lot, it's not the same kind of sadness. She's not traumatized by it. And in fact, her agency has been fully restored to her, and she's able to go back into the mundane world and reclaim her place as being, a firefighter. And she doesn't have to be the chief. She doesn't have to put all this distance between her and the other firefighters, where she wasn't willing to be friends or allow romantic relationships to unfold or any of that stuff. She doesn't have all these walls up, in other words, to protect herself anymore, because her PTSD is starting to relax and she's starting to heal. So I really like how in this story, it's not the magical world that heals her. The magical world is an expression of what is happening to her in an interior way. And once she works through that interiority in a literal, this is a literal world. I don't want to say it in a way where, the magical world is a metaphor and blah, blah, blah. I'm not saying that. It is a literal thing that she literally goes through. And that's what allows the trauma to stop. So she enters into the trauma that is the magical world. And then once that trauma has stopped, she's able to go back into the real world and be a different kind of person. And again, that's just, one of those things that fantasy can deliver that other genres, I think they have to do a lot of work to try and achieve the same effect in terms of setting. And so while it's frustrating sometimes to have in Sarah's perspective her anger and the way that she kind of backtracks on her personal growth and her fear, all of it makes so much sense to me and feels so authentic, and is such a delicate portrayal of a traumatized person that Henry manages to maintain throughout the book and arc into a place that doesn't like undo everything and just deliver her into like a perfect paradise of happiness. There's a lot of loss and sacrifice and work that goes into the place where she can start to be healthy, maybe. And there's even a kind of dark note to the end of the book because there's this other kind of juvenile sequoia that was roped into Romello's plot to try and suffocate the humans, which is where the book gets its name, right? The Breathless Sky. But this juvenile sequoia seems to have kind of the last word of the book, and that maybe it's going to try and engineer a new world order with Sarah because now that tree is outcast from the other trees because it was like a traitor. And so it's going to try to reach out to her. And, or at least that's how I understood the kind of final. There's like a poem at the end, an epilogue. And it seems to be from the perspective of this juvenile sequoia. And so it was traumatized in the same way that she was. There's like an echoing of her trauma. It like loses its family in the fire and it is outcast, set outside of its community. And it's looking to kind of take agency back and change the world somehow. And so it's like a dark impulse in the same way to grab for agency and looking towards Sarah to maybe do that. And so it's almost like the ending of a horror story or something where there's a kind of monstrous note at the end that everything is not resolved, which I think is actually, the way that it goes with trauma and PTSD, right? Like in this moment, she's managed to get her agency back and she's managed to get to a place where hopefully she can start to have a more healthy relationship with people. But that's not the end of the work. Like that's really just the beginning of the work in a way. She's only just barely started to heal. And so she has a lot of things ahead of her to forge a new world. She's going to have to get more comfortable taking agency and get more comfortable being vulnerable and on like that. And so she has a long journey ahead of her, but probably not wrapped up so much in the fantastical world. I also felt kind of frustrated with the mundane kind of third story in there about the scientist and him trying to find out the truth of the forest. And my frustration mainly lies in the kind of genre convention of urban fantasy that there has to be some kind of veil from the mundane world that is maintained so that the regular humans don't know about the existence of magical creatures or the magical world or how to access it. And what is the reason for that in the fiction? There is no real reason in urban fantasy for that kind of thing. It's merely to maintain the urban fantasy setting. And so that like a lot of urgency and energy tends to go into, oh no, don't let the humans know about this place or the gateway or whatever. They can't see the monsters, only we can see the monsters, or the elves are invisible to, or whatever, And the reason for it is only to maintain the urban fantasy setting, because if the humans knew, then now it's just a fantasy setting, right? Like there's humans over here and there's elves and wizards and whatever. Now it's a different setting, so it's a different kind of story. Well, I think that Veronica Henry uses this trope of urban fantasy in a really interesting way, actually, as it relates to the trauma, because protecting the magical world for Sarah is actually symbolically protecting the only zone where she has started to cultivate agency for herself. And so it's not really about protecting like an arbitrary protection of a zone for like a meta setting of urban fantasy. Instead, it's a symbolic protecting of her emerging agency vis-a-vis her trauma. So it's like somebody trying to find out her secrets and she's protecting her secrets because she can only start to take agency secretly. She's worried about him taking away her ability to make choices in the world. And that can't happen if she's going to heal. And so she needs to keep him at arm's length. She needs to keep him ignorant in order for her to progress. So I actually really like how that relationship is kind of calibrated in terms of the storytelling, because it doesn't really it respects the genre conventions, but it's using it in a interesting symbolic way, I guess. So after this, I picked up another one of Veronica Henry's books, and I'll probably be reading that sometime this month because I'm interested if she continues to explore these themes, or, is this like what all of her books are about, is climate and trauma, PTSD, or, what else is she interested in? So I guess I'll find out as I continue reading her books, and I'm sure that I'll go back and read the duology back to back and have a different experience, already understanding the shape of the story. I'm sure I missed a million things in the way that the books relate to each other and all of that stuff. So that'll be really interesting whenever I come back around the horn on that.